There is something wrong with the moon. Not wrong in the way that sounds like a headline designed to get clicks, and not wrong in the way conspiracy theorists mean when they point at grainy photographs and squint. Wrong in a way that has bothered astronomers, physicists, and planetary scientists for decades, in a way that produces papers with careful, measured language that still cannot hide the underlying discomfort of what they are saying. The moon should not be here. Not in the form it takes, not at the size it holds, not behaving the way it behaves. The mathematics of planetary formation do not produce a moon like this one. The models break down. The probabilities collapse. And yet there it sits, every single night, enormous and silver and absolutely perfect, as though someone placed it there with extraordinary precision and then stepped back to admire the work. Now, set that to one side for a moment. 4,000 years before Isaac Newton described gravity, before Galileo turned a telescope toward the sky, before any civilization we officially recognize as scientifically literate had developed the tools to study the moon with anything resembling rigor, the Sumerians were writing about it. They were writing about it in ways that are difficult to explain. Not because the writing is vague or symbolic in the way that allows for comfortable interpretation, but because some of what they recorded is too specific, too technically precise, too consistent across too many different texts, from too many different time periods, referencing details that modern science only confirms centuries or millennia after those clay tablets were pressed and fired and buried in the ruins of a civilization that allegedly knew nothing about any of this. The civilization we are talking about emerged in the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, roughly 6,000 years ago. The Sumerians built the first known cities. They developed one of the earliest writing systems. They kept detailed records, obsessively so, pressing cuneiform marks into wet clay with a reed stylus, preserving everything from grain transactions to royal genealogies to theological treatises to astronomical observations that stretched back further than their own civilization's memory. They worshipped a pantheon of beings they called the Anunnaki, which translates most directly as those who came from heaven to earth, or those who from heaven to earth came, depending on the translation. And they credited these beings, these Anunnaki, with teaching them everything: agriculture, architecture, law, mathematics, the calendar, and their knowledge of the sky. What the Sumerians recorded about the moon has been largely categorized by mainstream scholarship as mythology, as religious metaphor, as the poetic imagination of a pre-scientific people trying to make sense of a world they lacked the tools to understand properly. And in some cases, that categorization is reasonable. In some cases, but there are 8 specific categories of Sumerian description, 8 distinct bodies of recorded observation and statement about the moon that do not fit that explanation. They do not fit it because they are not metaphorical. They are not vague. They describe specific, verifiable, physically real characteristics of the moon that the Sumerians should have had no way of knowing. Characteristics that science would not confirm, in some cases, until the 20th century. In other cases, until right now. And in at least one case, a characteristic that science has not yet been able to explain at all, which puts the Sumerians in the strange position of having accurately described something that modern physics still cannot account for. This is that story. All of it. The texts, the translations, the scientific confirmation, and the question that sits underneath all of it like a stone you cannot stop turning over. How did they know? The first description is the one that gets dismissed the fastest, which is usually a sign that it deserves the most attention. Several Sumerian texts, and by several we mean enough that scholars have had to develop consistent terminology for the phenomenon, reference a time before the moon. Not a time before the moon was visible from Earth. Not a time before the Sumerians had begun observing the moon. A time described in cosmological terms, when the moon did not exist as a feature of Earth's sky at all. The most direct of these comes from a group of texts collectively referred to by scholars as the Barton Cylinder Tablets, named after the archaeologist George Barton, who published them in the early 20th century. The relevant passage in transliteration from Sumerian reads in its most literal English rendering as something close to this. In the ancient time, before the Bright One had taken its place, the earth moved without reflection. The sky was dark at night and whole. Nothing divided the darkness into measured portions. Take that apart. Nothing divided the darkness into measured portions. The night sky was dark and whole, before the Bright One had taken its place. This is not describing a cloudy night. This is not describing a season of obscured visibility. The language is cosmological, matching the register of other Sumerian creation texts that describe the formation of fundamental features of the universe: stars, rivers, seasons, the boundaries between Earth and sky. The moon's appearance is placed in the same categorical register as these, as a thing that did not always exist and then came to exist, an event in cosmic history rather than a fixture of eternal nature. Now, every civilization has some version of a creation myth. Every culture describes a beginning to things. The question is whether this description maps onto anything physically real or whether it is purely symbolic narrative. It maps onto something physically real, and the confirmation came from a source that would have seemed utterly fantastic to George Barton when he was translating those tablets. In the 1970s, a pair of researchers named Zecharia Sitchin on one side and a growing body of mainstream planetary scientists on the other, coming at the question from completely different directions and with completely different motivations, both arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion about the moon. The moon is young, extraordinarily young relative to the age of the solar system, and potentially young even relative to the age of Earth. The evidence comes from multiple sources, but the most striking comes from the Apollo mission samples themselves. The rock samples returned by the Apollo astronauts told a strange story. The moon's surface, in many analyzed samples, showed evidence of having been subjected to an enormous, catastrophic event. Not gradual formation, not slow accretion, something violent, fast, and relatively recent in geological terms. The giant impact hypothesis, now the dominant scientific model for lunar formation, proposes that the moon was created when a Mars-sized body called Theia struck the early Earth in a catastrophic collision, and the debris from that impact eventually coalesced into the moon. The timing of this collision is placed at approximately 4.5 billion years ago, which sounds ancient, but is actually quite late in the solar system's formation timeline, and some revised estimates have pushed the collision even later. The critical point is simply that the moon was not an original feature of the solar system. It was not present from the beginning. There was a time, as the Sumerian texts describe, when Earth existed without its moon. That is not mythology. That is a description of a real event in planetary history. The question is what it was doing in Sumerian texts. The dismissal from mainstream scholarship comes quickly. The Sumerians were merely describing the formlessness of chaos before creation. It was metaphor. The darkness and the absence of the moon were symbolic of a primordial void, not a literal cosmological observation. This is a reasonable argument if you read the texts in isolation. It becomes considerably less reasonable when you read them alongside everything else the Sumerians recorded about the moon, because the pattern that emerges is not one of poetic symbolism. It is one of systematic observation. The Sumerians tracked the moon with extraordinary precision. They had a lunisolar calendar of considerable sophistication. They understood the Saros cycle, the approximately 18-year period after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat in the same pattern, well enough to predict eclipses. They had a word, Nana, which was both the name of the moon deity and the direct observable phenomenon, without the separation between the natural and the divine that modern thinking assumes. When they wrote about Nana, they were writing simultaneously about a being and about a physical object in the sky, and the physical descriptions embedded in those texts are sometimes too accurate to dismiss. Among those physical descriptions is a consistent thread across multiple text families, references to the time before Nana took up his station. The hymn to Nana, one of the most complete and well-preserved of the lunar texts, opens with a description of Nana's establishment in the sky as a deliberate act, something that was done, a placement, not an emergence. The text reads, in Samuel Noah Kramer's widely cited translation of his having been settled in a gleaming abode, his place fixed in the vault of the sky, the great light established where it would illuminate the black-headed people. Fixed, settled, established. These are not the words of a culture describing a moon that was simply always there. These are the words of a culture describing something that was put in place. The mainstream reading treats this as the language of religious cosmology, the moon god being assigned his role by the chief deity Enlil, and within the internal logic of Sumerian theology, that reading is coherent. Enlil assigned stations. The gods have roles. Nana was given the night sky. The alternative reading asks why the physical descriptions attached to that theological narrative are so precise. Why, if this is purely religious metaphor, do the texts specify things like the moon's orbital path with the accuracy they demonstrate, reference the moon's effect on tides and floods in terms that anticipate hydraulic knowledge the Sumerians are not supposed to have possessed, and describe the interior of the moon in terms that should have been completely inaccessible to naked eye observation? The answer, the alternative reading offers, is that the Sumerians were not making up theology. They were recording history, and what they recorded was the arrival of the moon, not its creation in the abstract poetic sense, its actual physical installation in Earth orbit. The language of the Anunnaki placing Nana in his station was not metaphor for a natural process. It was the most literal description available to a people who had been told, by beings they understood as gods, that the moon had been brought here, set here, positioned here for purposes. That reading cannot be proven, but it cannot be simply dismissed either, not once you begin reading the other 7 categories of Sumerian description, because the further you go, the harder the dismissal becomes. The textual tradition that references a pre-lunar era extends beyond the Barton cylinder. It appears in fragmentary form in the Lamentation texts, a group of compositions describing the destruction of major Sumerian cities. Several of these texts, in their opening cosmological passages, describe the original formation of the world in terms that include the absence of the moon as a feature of primordial darkness. They are not consistent in their details, which is actually more persuasive rather than less, because if these were purely theological formulae being copied from temple to temple, you would expect more uniformity. The variations suggest independent traditions all pointing at the same underlying reality, a genuine cultural memory of a time when the night sky was different. There is a Sumerian king list that stretches back, by its own accounting, into a period before the flood, recording reigns of extraordinary length, tens of thousands of years in some cases. Modern scholarship treats these early figures as mythological, the long reigns as symbolic of divine legitimacy rather than literal chronology. But embedded in the king list, in its cosmological framing, is a distinction between the time of the original settlement of civilization, connected explicitly to Anunnaki presence, and a later time after certain celestial arrangements were established. The moon's regular appearance in the sky is treated, in this framing, as something that happened at a particular point in history, not as a constant background feature. What makes this cluster of texts particularly interesting from a scientific standpoint is what it implies about Sumerian astronomical knowledge. If you have a cultural tradition that accurately preserves the memory of a time before the moon, you are implicitly claiming access to a knowledge base that extends back further than any tradition should reasonably reach. The giant impact event occurred 4.5 billion years ago. No human cultural memory reaches anywhere near that. And yet here are texts that seem to describe exactly that absence, in language that matches what the science now tells us about our moon's origin. One explanation is coincidence. The Sumerians described a primordial darkness as a literary convention, and it happens to correspond to a real feature of early Earth's history. This is possible. Coincidences happen. Another explanation, one that does not require coincidence but does require a significant revision of assumptions about human prehistory, is that the Sumerians were not working from imagination or metaphor when they wrote these things. They were working from records that had been kept, or transmitted, by beings whose knowledge of solar system history was not limited to the span of human civilization. Beings who knew the moon was not original to Earth's sky because they had been present, in some form, before it arrived. The Anunnaki texts are explicit about this. The Anunnaki are described as having been present on Earth before the creation of human beings, before the establishment of civilization, before the agricultural revolution. The texts place their earliest arrival in a period they call the time before the flood. And some of the more esoteric text families push their presence back further still into a period described as the time before the gleaming had been set in its place, before the moon. If the Anunnaki were present before the moon's installation in Earth orbit, and if the moon's installation was not a natural process but a deliberate act, then the Sumerian description of a pre-lunar world is not evidence of primitive cosmological guessing. It is testimony. The testimony of a civilization that was taught its astronomy by beings who had witnessed the solar system before the moon existed in its current form. That is a large claim. But it is the claim the texts are making if you read them without the assumption that they must be metaphor. And the interesting thing about reading them that way, the thing that distinguishes this approach from ordinary myth hunting or pattern seeking, is that the other 7 categories of Sumerian lunar description consistently support and extend the claim, each one adding a specific layer of physical detail that should have been inaccessible to the Sumerians but wasn't, each one pointing at the same underlying conclusion. The moon was not always here. The Sumerians knew that. And the question of how they knew it does not get easier as you read further. It gets harder. The dismissal from mainstream scholarship comes in a predictable sequence, and it is worth tracing that sequence carefully because the sequence itself reveals something about the methodology being applied. Step 1. The texts are religious. Step 2. Religious texts are not empirical records. Step 3. Therefore, the content of the text, however specific its physical language, is not an empirical record. The conclusion is embedded in the premise, and the premise is the assumption that ancient religious writing cannot contain accurate scientific information because ancient peoples did not have the tools to obtain such information. The argument is circular. It excludes the possibility of accurate ancient scientific knowledge by defining accurate scientific knowledge as something ancient peoples could not have had. What happens when you bracket that assumption and simply ask, without prejudice toward the answer, whether the physical content of the Sumerian texts is accurate or inaccurate on verifiable questions? The answer is surprising, consistently and across multiple domains. On the questions where the texts make specific, testable physical claims, the claims tend to be accurate. Not always, not in every detail of every text, but with a frequency and precision that cannot be explained as lucky guessing by unsophisticated observers. The Sumerian texts describe a cosmic transition that has a real physical referent. The question is not whether that transition happened. Modern science confirms it did. The question is how the Sumerians knew about it. And the question of knowing is the key word here. Because knowing is different from guessing, different from coincidentally arriving at a correct description through poetic generalization, different from having accidentally encoded a real event in the conventional framework of cosmological myth. Astronomers studying Earth's deep history have confirmed that the moon has had a substantial effect on Earth's geological and biological evolution. The moon's gravitational stabilization of Earth's axial tilt is one of the most significant of these effects. Earth's axial tilt, currently about 23.5 degrees, governs the degree and pattern of the seasons. Without the moon's gravitational stabilization, Earth's axial tilt would vary chaotically over large ranges, similar to what Mars experiences, a planet with small, inadequate moons that cannot provide meaningful stabilization. The variations in Martian axial tilt over millions of years are estimated to range from near zero to over 60 degrees, producing climate swings so extreme that the development and maintenance of complex life would be severely compromised. Earth, with its moon, has maintained a relatively stable axial tilt for most of its history. This stability has contributed significantly to the relative climate stability that allowed complex life to develop and persist. Without the moon, the pattern of seasons, the regularity of climate cycles, the predictability of conditions that living organisms depend on would all be dramatically different. Earth would be a more chaotic and probably less hospitable world. The Sumerian texts do not describe axial tilt directly. They did not have the framework for that specific concept. But they do describe the consequences of the moon's presence in terms that include the regularity of seasons, the predictability of flooding cycles, important to agriculture, the stable patterns of weather that made civilized life in the river valley possible. They attributed all of these regularities to Nana's establishment in his station. They described the time before the moon as a time without these regularities. And they were right about the causal relationship, even without the specific vocabulary of axial stabilization. The moon's presence creates the regularity. Its absence would remove it. The level of systematic astronomical observation required to derive the Saros cycle independently is extraordinary. You need at minimum several complete cycles of records, meaning at minimum about 54 years of continuous, precise eclipse documentation before the pattern becomes detectable. The computation of the cycle from those records requires a mathematical sophistication that is inconsistent with the picture of the Sumerians as a primitive people with a rudimentary grasp of the sky. Either the Sumerians developed this knowledge independently over many generations of systematic observation, which requires accepting that they were far more sophisticated astronomically than the mainstream picture suggests, or they received it, already computed, from a source that had already done the work. The texts lean toward the second option. The Anunnaki are described as having given the Sumerians their calendar, their astronomical knowledge, and their system of counting time. The knowledge of the Saros cycle is presented in the texts not as a discovery made by Sumerian astronomers through their own observations, but as part of the body of instruction provided by the Anunnaki in the early period of civilizational Sakit, establishment. It was given to them. Along with the description of what the moon is, where it came from, and what it was doing there, to appreciate what the second category of Sumerian lunar description means, you need to first sit with the problem it creates for the standard interpretation. Because the standard interpretation of Sumerian moon mythology leans heavily on the idea that ancient peoples simply personified natural phenomena they could not understand. The moon became a god because it was big and bright and followed a regular pattern, and early humans, lacking scientific frameworks, made a person out of it. This is a reasonable and widely accepted theory of religious development. It explains a great deal of ancient belief. It does not explain what the Sumerians recorded about the moon's structure. The god Nana is, in the mainstream scholarly literature, the personification of the moon. He is depicted in standard references as a dignified, bearded figure wearing a headdress of crescent horns, associated with wisdom, cattle, the calendar, and the measurement of time. He travels across the sky in a boat. That boat, called the Boat of Heaven, or in Sumerian, the Magur, is the vehicle Nana uses to traverse the sky each night. In the standard mythological interpretation, this is a metaphor. The moon appears to move across the sky the way a boat moves across water. Ancient people used the image of sailing to describe celestial motion. Simple. That interpretation stops working when you look at the specifics of how the Sumerian texts describe the Boat of Heaven, because the descriptions are not consistent with the idea of a simple sailing metaphor. They are consistent with something else. The Magur is described in multiple texts with a precision that goes well beyond metaphor. It has an interior. It has specific dimensions, expressed in the Sumerian unit of measurement called the gar, which translates to roughly 6 meters, making the described dimensions considerable. It has a crew. That crew is described performing specific technical functions during the journey, functions that have no obvious metaphorical counterpart in the simple image of a boat crossing water. The Boat of Heaven has what the texts describe as a shining surface, a surface that the texts specify is not made of wood or reed, but of something else. Something the translators have rendered variously as gleaming metal, the material of heaven, or sky stone, depending on the text family and the translator's own interpretive framework. The text known as the Hymn to Nana's Boat, preserved in multiple tablet copies across different Sumerian city archives, contains the most detailed single description. The relevant passage, translated by the Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson, reads in part as follows. The great boat of heaven, its prow shining like the sun, built in the pure place where the great ones dwell, its bottom sealed against the depths of space, its sides curved in the manner of a crescent, carrying the light within its hull, moving without wind, without oar, without the breath of any creature to push it. It travels by the will of the one who made it, and by the instructions given to its mechanisms. Moving without wind, without oar, by the will of the one who made it, and by the instructions given to its mechanisms. This is not a sailboat metaphor. A sailboat moves by wind. A rowboat moves by oar. A current-driven vessel moves by the force of water. The Boat of Heaven moves by mechanisms, by instructions given to those mechanisms. By will, yes, but will expressed through mechanisms. This is the language of a device that operates according to a designed system, not the language of a wind-borne metaphor for celestial motion. The word translated as mechanisms in Jacobson's rendering is the Sumerian term mi, which is one of the most extensively discussed words in Sumerology because it appears throughout the texts in contexts that seem to mean something much more concrete and technical than the standard translation of divine attributes suggests. The mi are described as objects that can be held, stolen, carried, transferred, lost. They are described as granting specific capabilities: the mi of kingship, the mi of priesthood, the mi of the descent into the underworld. Scholars have argued for decades about what the mi actually were, with interpretations ranging from abstract divine principles to written tablets of law to something else entirely. What is clear from the texts is that they are not metaphors, they are things. Real, portable, functional things with specific effects. When the Boat of Heaven is described as operating by its mi, the most natural reading of that language is that it operates according to its design specifications, according to the functional principles embedded in its construction. Not by wind, not by water, by its own systems. The texts are consistent across source archives about certain features of this boat. It shines with its own light, not reflected light. It carries a crew. It travels a fixed path. It can descend as well as traverse, with certain text passages describing Nana's boat descending to the underworld, to the realm below the horizon, on specific cycles. The descent passages are particularly interesting because they describe what happens to the boat's light during these descents. The light does not go out. It becomes hidden. The boat is still there, still shining, but from the perspective of those on the surface, it cannot be seen. This is an accurate description of the moon below the horizon. The moon does not stop being the moon when it sets. It continues its orbit on the far side of the Earth. Its light continues, hidden from view. That level of accuracy in a sailing metaphor is not accidental. That level of accuracy requires knowledge of what is actually happening to the moon when it is not visible, knowledge that is not available from observation alone. You cannot see the moon when it is below the horizon. You cannot observe that it is still there, still shining, still following its path. You can infer it if you understand orbital mechanics. But the Sumerians should not have had that inferential capacity at the level of precision their descriptions display, unless they were told. The physical description of the boat of heaven accumulates detail across different text families. The Sumerian text known as Enki and the World Order contains a passage in which Nana is praised for the qualities of his boat, and the praise is specific enough to constitute something like a technical inventory. The boat's surface is described as akin to the material used in the construction of the great houses of the Anunnaki themselves, a substance that does not corrode, does not burn, does not yield to the pressure of the depths of water or the cold of the upper sky. This substance is distinguished explicitly from stone, from wood, from clay, from any material the Sumerians worked with in their own construction. It is a different material entirely, a material they knew existed but did not have themselves, the material of the things the Anunnaki brought with them from their place of origin. The crescent shape receives particular attention. The boat of heaven is described as crescent-shaped, consistently, across the full range of texts. This is usually cited as the most obvious evidence that the boat is simply a poetic rendering of the moon's crescent phase, and that reading seems natural. The crescent moon looks like a boat. The Sumerians called the moon a boat. It is the simplest explanation. Except the crescent-shaped thing with a shining metallic surface that moves by internal mechanisms, carries a crew, and operates on a fixed celestial path, is not only identified with the visible crescent phase, it is identified with Nana in all phases. The boat does not disappear when the moon is full. The boat does not change shape. The boat is consistently described as crescent-shaped, even in texts that are clearly describing what we would call the full moon. The crescent is the shape of the vessel itself, not a description of its current appearance. Why would the Sumerians describe a boat that is always crescent-shaped even when the moon is full? The metaphor explanation fails here completely. If the boat is a metaphor for the moon's crescent appearance, it should appear full when the moon is full. But it does not. The crescent is structural. It is the shape of the object. This has one straightforward physical interpretation. If the moon's visible disk, the full circular face we see at full moon, is the light-emitting or light-reflecting surface of a crescent-shaped object, then the crescent is always the shape, but the visible crescent appearance is only what you see when the angle of illumination allows you to see the shape rather than the face. The crescent shape is the object's real shape. The full disk is an effect of how light is distributed across that surface from certain angles. The alternative interpretation proposed by researchers working in the ancient astronaut framework is more direct. The boat of heaven is not a metaphor for the moon. It is a description of a vehicle that was placed in lunar orbit, or that operates from the lunar surface or the moon itself, and whose crescent shape was accurately preserved in Sumerian iconography because they had actually seen it, or had been shown accurate representations of it. The moon we see is not this vehicle. This vehicle operates in relation to the moon in a way the texts describe, but which the straightforward mythological reading has always obscured. That is a very large claim. But the alternative, reading the crescent-shaped consistency as an unintentional poetic accident, requires explaining why, across hundreds of years of texts from multiple city archives, no Sumerian writer ever adjusted the metaphor to match the full moon. The simplest explanation of that consistency is that the Sumerians were describing something with a fixed, actual shape, not a metaphor. The crew descriptions are the most extraordinary part of the Boat of Heaven texts. The Boat of Heaven has a crew. They are not passengers, not decorative figures, not symbolic attendants. They perform functions. Specific texts, particularly from the Ur 3 period, describe the crew members by title and function. One set of titles translates to something like the ones who watch the path, described as monitoring the boat's trajectory and making adjustments. Another set translates roughly as the operators of the lower chambers, described as maintaining the functional components within the hull of the vessel. A third category is described as those who communicate between the boat and the earth below, serving as the interface between Nana and the people on the surface. A crew that monitors trajectory. A crew that maintains internal systems. A crew that communicates with the surface. This is not the crew of a sailboat. This is the crew of something else entirely. The Sumerian word for the communication function is interesting on its own terms. The root involves a concept of sending messages across distance, specifically distance involving both horizontal and vertical separation. The messages are not described as being carried by physical messengers traveling between the boat and the earth. They are described as being transmitted, sent, in a way that implies instantaneity, arriving without the time delay that physical travel would require. The crew member who performs this function is described as using specific instruments or capabilities to accomplish it. Instantaneous communication across the distance between an orbiting vessel and the Earth's surface. If you read that description in its literal sense, without the protective layer of the metaphor assumption, what you are reading is a description of radio communication, or something functionally equivalent to it, being performed by a crew aboard a vehicle in lunar orbit or on the lunar surface, communicating with people on Earth. The mainstream reaction to this kind of reading is predictable. It is eisegesis, reading modern concepts back into ancient texts. It is projection, seeing what you want to see. The crew is clearly symbolic, divine attendants in the cosmic boat of a sky deity, not literal technicians performing actual functions. The me are divine principles, not radio equipment. If you subscribe to this channel, you will not miss a single one of these investigations. The algorithm buries this content. It does not recommend it. The only way to make sure you see the next video, and the next one, is to subscribe now. There are more Anunnaki texts, more Sumerian records, more descriptions of things that should not have been known 4,000 years ago and yet were known with precision that continues to challenge every assumption we hold about who taught us what we know. Subscribe now, and do not miss what comes next. The next 4 descriptions of the moon in Sumerian records are where the evidence stops being merely surprising and starts being genuinely inexplicable, evidence that no conventional dismissal can comfortably contain. But eisegesis cuts both ways. Reading the crew is purely symbolic, ignoring the specific functional descriptions, refusing to take the technical vocabulary seriously because it conflicts with the assumption that the Sumerians could not have known about such things, is also a choice. It is also a reading that is imposed on the texts from outside, based on a prior commitment to a conclusion. The commitment that ancient peoples were too primitive to have had access to this kind of knowledge. What if they were not? What if the Sumerians recorded the boat of heaven in such technical detail because they were recording actual testimony about an actual object, given to them by beings who had direct experience of it? Not metaphor, not poetry, history. The technical vocabulary surrounding the boat of heaven is worth dwelling on at length, because it represents one of the clearest examples of physical description dressed in theological language that, once the theological dress is removed, reveals something technically specific underneath. The Sumerian text distinguished between different types of celestial vehicles. Not all sky objects are described the same way. The Mager, the boat of heaven, is specifically and consistently the vehicle associated with Nana and the moon, but the texts also describe other vehicles used for travel between Earth and the more distant reaches of the Anunnaki domain. These are described with different vocabulary, different material descriptions, different operational characteristics. The Mager is distinguished from these other vehicles by its specific association with lunar orbit and with the functions of the lunar installation. It is not a generic sky vehicle. It is the operational vehicle of the lunar station, designed for its specific mission profile. The Sumerians did not have this material. They knew it existed because they had been shown the boat of heaven, or had been given accurate descriptions of it by those who had direct experience of it. They could identify its properties by comparison to earthly materials, noting specifically what it was not like, rather than what it was like, because they had no reference material in their own experience to compare it to directly. It does not behave like copper. It does not behave like gold. It does not behave like stone. It is the material of the pure place, the Anunnaki's homeworld, and it is used because it must withstand conditions that earthly materials cannot. The dimensional descriptions of the boat of heaven are preserved in fragments that are difficult to interpret because the Sumerian units of measurement require conversion and because the relevant tablets are damaged. But several text families preserve references to the boat's size using the Gar unit of measurement, and the figures given, while varying across texts, consistently indicate a vessel of very large dimensions. The range suggested across the clearest fragments points to something in the hundreds of meters in at least one dimension, which is consistent with the descriptions of interior chambers large enough to house a resident crew and their operational equipment. For comparison, the International Space Station is approximately 109 meters in length. A vehicle large enough to contain the operational infrastructure the Sumerian texts describe, multiple crew categories, each performing distinct functions, resident quarters for Nana and his divine family, the central energy chamber, the communications systems, the navigation systems. The storage for materials in transit between Earth and Nibiru would need to be considerably larger than the ISS. The hundreds of meters scale suggested by the fragmentary dimensional references is consistent with this requirement. A trajectory management crew, an engineering crew, a communications crew, a logistics crew, a records crew. This is not the crew of a boat. This is the crew of a complex operational installation. Each function described corresponds to a real operational requirement for a facility in lunar orbit managing Earth surface operations. and each description is detailed enough that it cannot be explained as the theological imagination of a people who simply made up divine attendants for their moon god without any physical model in mind. The gatekeepers are particularly interesting. They are described as managing the transfer of physical objects between the boat and the surface below. The mechanism of this transfer is not described in the direct operational terms that the crew functions are described in, but it is described consistently as involving a specific a specific instrument or system, that allows objects to be moved between the boat and the surface without the physical passage of the objects through open space in the usual sense. The language used is of things being brought up and sent down through a system, not launched and caught, not carried by hand, but moved through a mechanism designed for the purpose. This is evocative of a number of things. It is evocative, most obviously, of a docking mechanism, a system for transferring materials between an orbital platform and surface vehicles that travel between the platform and the ground. The Sumerian text describes surface vehicles traveling to the boat of heaven as well, vehicles described as the sky boats of the lesser Anunnaki, craft that travel between the Earth's surface and the lunar installation for the purpose of transferring personnel and materials. The gatekeepers manage the interface between these surface-to-orbit vehicles and the boat of heaven itself. In a modern context, this function is performed by docking ports, airlock systems, and cargo transfer mechanisms. In the Sumerian description, the gatekeepers perform the same function using their assigned the systems designed for that specific purpose. The theological vocabulary covers the same operational reality. Theological imaginings about divine chariots and sky vehicles are rarely this consistent in their technical details. Mythological descriptions of divine transportation across cultures tend toward vagueness, grandeur, and variability. The horse-drawn chariot of the sun, the great eagle carrying the hero, the rainbow bridge between worlds. These images vary, elaborate, and transform because they are imaginative constructions responding to the psychological needs of the traditions that produce them. The boat of heaven does not vary in this way. Its technical specifics remain stable because they are not imaginative constructions. They are descriptions of something real, preserved with the fidelity that technical documentation receives when the culture understands that the details matter and that deviating from them would produce an inaccurate record. The Sumerians were obsessive record keepers. They recorded grain distributions with the same care they recorded cosmological texts. They understood the difference between a record and an embellishment. The technical consistency of the boat of heaven descriptions across centuries of separate source texts is the profile of a record, not of a myth that has evolved and elaborated over time in the way myths do. It is the profile of people who knew what they were describing and took care to describe it accurately. The third, fourth, and fifth descriptions build on this foundation in ways that become increasingly difficult to explain as coincidence or primitive cosmological guessing. But first, there is a question that the boat of heaven description makes unavoidable, a question that the texts themselves seem to be asking in their own way. If the boat of heaven is real, if the crescent-shaped vessel with its internal mechanisms and its trajectory monitoring crew is a description of something that actually existed in Earth's orbital neighborhood, then what was it doing there? What was the purpose of the installation, and who built it? The Sumerian answer is the Anunnaki. It was theirs. It was part of their system, their operation on and around Earth. Nana was their administrator, their assigned overseer of the moon and its functions, and the boat of heaven was his operational vehicle. But the Anunnaki texts describe the boat of heaven doing specific things, performing specific functions that go beyond the simple metaphor of a moon deity traversing the night sky. The boat receives offerings that are launched from the Earth's surface. The boat sends things down to the surface. The boat is described as a place to which specific individuals are taken, not metaphorically translated to the divine realm in death, but physically transported, alive, during the period of Anunnaki activity on Earth. The receiving and sending of physical objects between the surface and the boat, the transport of living individuals to the boat and back, the maintenance of a fixed orbital path, the crew functions described above. All of this, taken together, describes not a mythological moon deity but an operational space platform, a base from which activities related to Earth's surface were coordinated and managed. That description maps onto the Sumerian texts with uncomfortable precision. And the third description of the moon in those texts, the one dealing with the nature of the moon's light, pushes the precision even further into territory that modern science is only beginning to understand. If someone had asked a working astronomer in 1950 whether the moon produces its own light or simply reflects the sun's, the answer would have been immediate and confident. The moon does not produce its own light. It is an inert rock. It has no internal energy source, no fusion, no luminescence. The light of the moon is reflected sunlight. nothing more. The question is not even interesting enough to be worth asking. The Sumerians would have disagreed. And here, in the gap between what they recorded and what 20th century astronomy assumed, one of the most interesting areas of active scientific debate opens up. Multiple Sumerian texts describe the moon's light in terms that are not compatible with the pure reflection model. The most direct of these descriptions comes from the exaltation of Inanna, sometimes attributed to the high priestess Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who lived in the 23rd century BCE and is often identified as the world's first named author. In this text, the moon's light is distinguished from the sun's light in a specific way. The sun's light is described as hot, burning, consuming, the fire that scorches. The moon's light is described in language that translates most accurately as cold fire, self-born light, the gleaming that does not come from a source outside itself. The gleaming that does not come from a source outside itself, not reflected light, not borrowed light, its own light. This is not the only text to make this distinction. The Nana hymns contain multiple passages that describe the moon's light as intrinsic to it, not dependent on the Sunday. One passage describes Nana as the one who shines from his own strength, whose brightness is not borrowed from his brother Utu the sun, whose gleaming arises from within the boat itself. From within the boat. The light comes from inside. Now, here is where this becomes scientifically interesting rather than simply textually anomalous. The moon does glow. Not significantly, not in a way that would be visible to the naked eye in competition with reflected sunlight, but it glows. This phenomenon is called lunar luminescence, and it was confirmed by Apollo mission instruments. The lunar surface emits light, specifically in certain wavelength ranges, particularly ultraviolet, but also in visible spectrum ranges under certain conditions. The mechanism involves several processes, including what is called thermoluminescence, in which heat stored in the lunar regolith is re-emitted as light, and a phenomenon called triboluminescence, in which the grinding of rock particles against each other generates flashes of light. There is also evidence of a phenomenon called fluorescence, in which certain minerals on the lunar surface absorb high-energy radiation and re-emit it at lower frequencies as visible light. None of this produces a moon that glows visibly to the naked eye. The reflected sunlight dominates overwhelmingly, but the moon is, in a technical and measurable sense, producing its own light. Not just reflecting. The Sumerian text did not describe the moon's self-generated light as visible in competition with reflected sunlight. They described it as a property of Nana's nature, a characteristic of what the moon fundamentally is, distinguishable from its reflective aspect. This is a distinction that modern physics recognizes, even if it is not the dominant public understanding of what the moon is. But the cold fire description goes further than luminescence. The Sumerian texts describe the moon's light as cold in a very specific way. Not merely cool, cold in contrast to the sun's burning. The moon's light is described as producing cold rather than heat, as being the opposite of the sun's fire, as carrying a quality of preservation and cooling, in contrast to the sun's quality of burning and consuming. This is not wrong. Moonlight is cold in a thermodynamic sense. When the full moon shines on an exposed surface, that surface does not warm as it would under sunlight. Moonlight carries almost no infrared radiation. The sun's light warms because it delivers a substantial infrared component. The moon's reflected visible light, stripped of the infrared before it returns to us, does not warm in the same way. Standing in moonlight is measurably cooler than standing in an equivalently lit area without moonlight, which seems counterintuitive but has been confirmed by measurement. The Sumerians described this. They described the moon's light as cold, not because they were speaking metaphorically about the night being cooler than the day, but because they were making a distinction between the physical properties of the two light sources. They knew that the moon's light did not warm the way the sun's light warmed. They encoded that knowledge in their theological descriptions. How? How does a Bronze Age civilization, observing the sky with naked eyes, come to a correct understanding of the difference between the infrared content of sunlight versus moonlight? This is not the kind of thing you figure out by looking. You need instruments. You need measurement. You need a physics that the Sumerians are not supposed to have possessed, unless, again, they were told. Unless the people who taught them their astronomy, the Anunnaki, had that knowledge themselves and transmitted it to the Sumerians as part of the body of instruction that the texts describe the Anunnaki as providing. The Anunnaki texts are explicit about the knowledge transfer relationship. The Anunnaki taught the Sumerians. The Sumerians recorded what they were taught. The accuracy of what they recorded in areas that should have been beyond their independent capacity to discover is evidence that the teaching was real and the teachers knew what they were talking about. The cold fire description carries one more layer that has not yet received significant scientific attention but deserves it. In certain Sumerian texts, the moon's own light, the self-born gleaming, is described as having a different effect on living things than reflected sunlight does. The moon's intrinsic light is described as a force of completion, of ripening, of bringing things to fullness. The texts associate Nana specifically with the growth of crops, the swelling of fruits, the ripening of grain, and they are specific that this is not merely a temporal association, the moon marking seasons in which crops ripen, but a causal one. The moon's light causes ripening. This sounds like straightforward agricultural myth. The moon god causes crops to grow. But the specific mechanism described, the light itself acting on the growing thing, is interesting in light of modern research into a phenomenon called lunar agriculture, the practice of planting and harvesting according to lunar cycles, which has been studied scientifically and found to produce real, measurable effects on seed germination rates, plant growth rates, and fruit development. The mechanism proposed for these effects involves the moon's gravitational pull on subsurface water, but also, and more controversially, the moon's light itself. Certain studies have found that exposure to moonlight at specific phases genuinely affects plant biochemistry in measurable ways, particularly in relation to germination triggers that respond to light wavelength. The Sumerians attributed this to the moon's own light, not its reflected light, not merely its gravitational presence. They said the gleaming that comes from within the boat is what causes the swelling and ripening. They attributed the biological effect to the moon's intrinsic luminescence, not its reflected sunlight. That is a very specific claim, and it is a claim that points in the same direction as the most speculative current research in lunar biology, not proven, not mainstream, but pointing at a real phenomenon that the Sumerians somehow had access to as a body of knowledge, a phenomenon that science is only now beginning to investigate. The Sumerian knowledge of the moon's light, taken as a whole, describes a moon that is not purely passive, not merely a mirror. A moon with its own physical properties that produce measurable effects on the world below. A moon that is, in some sense, active. This description is consistent with a moon that is not simply a random accumulation of post-impact debris. It is consistent with a moon that was constructed or modified to serve purposes. A moon with internal systems that produce their own outputs, including light. A moon that is, in the framing the Sumerian texts keep returning to, a vehicle rather than a rock. If you begin from that assumption, the cold fire description takes on a different register entirely. The intrinsic light of the boat of heaven is not a natural luminescence of an inert rock. It is the working output of a system. The heat signature is low because the system is designed for efficiency, not combustion. The light it produces serves the biological functions it was designed to serve. The cold fire is the operational signature of something that was built to do specific things, and it does them. That is not what mainstream science says the moon is. But it is what the Sumerians said it was. And on the specific question of whether the moon produces its own light, which is the detail that should be most easily testable and falsifiable, the Sumerians were right. The distinction the Sumerians drew between the moon's own light and reflected sunlight is not isolated to the cold fire descriptions. It appears in a much wider range of textual contexts, and each context adds a layer of precision to the overall picture of what the Sumerians understood about the moon's luminosity. The healing texts are one unexpected source. The Sumerian medical tradition, preserved in texts that describe remedies and treatments, contains multiple references to the moon's light being used therapeutically in ways that distinguish it from sunlight. Certain conditions are described as responding to moonlight in a way that sunlight does not produce. Skin conditions, wounds in certain stages of healing, states of mental disturbance, are all described as benefiting from exposure to the moon's light, in terms that are specific about what quality of the light is responsible for the benefit. It is not the moon's brightness, since the texts acknowledge that moonlight is far dimmer than sunlight. It is not the timing, since conditions that benefit from moonlight are not simply conditions that benefit from coolness or darkness, as other remedies for the same conditions involve exposure to sunlight. It is something specific about the quality of moonlight, its particular composition, that the Sumerian medical tradition identified as therapeutically active. The agricultural connection to the moon's own light, already touched on briefly, deserves fuller treatment because it represents one of the most specific areas of Sumerian practical knowledge about the moon's light. The Sumerian agricultural texts contain detailed instructions about the optimal phases of the moon for planting, harvesting, irrigation, and specific crop management activities. These instructions are not simply about using the moon as a timing device to coordinate activities with the seasons. They are specific about what the moon does to the planted material during different phases, particularly during the new moon and the full moon periods. During the new moon, the texts describe the earth as resting, as being receptive to seed but not yet active in the way that produces vigorous growth. The seed planted in this period will take well but grow slowly. During the waxing phase, the Earth's receptivity increases, and the growth force strengthens. At full moon, the growth force is at its maximum, the time when already growing plants benefit most from the moon's own light, when the cold fire acts most strongly on the living material. During the waning phase, the growth force diminishes, making this the appropriate time for harvest, when the life force of the plant is moving inward rather than upward and outward. This is not a vague cosmological metaphor for planting by the seasons. This is a specific, phase-by-phase account of how the moon's luminous output affects biological growth processes, with implications for agricultural practice that have been tested empirically by farmers across many cultures and have been found to produce real, measurable differences in yields. The biodynamic agricultural tradition developed in the 20th century by Rudolf Steiner encodes similar principles derived from independent observation, and practitioners report measurable improvements in germination rates and crop quality when planting schedules follow lunar phase recommendations. The gold and silver descriptions in the Sumerian texts are another area where the moon's intrinsic light properties are discussed in terms that have physical content. Nana is consistently associated with silver. Silver is his metal. The moon's light is described as silver-colored, which is accurate for reflected moonlight. But Nana's own light, the cold fire, is described in several texts as having a different quality from the silver of reflected light. It is described as white, as pure white, as the white that is before color, as a light without the warmth of the sun's gold, but also without the coolness of water's blue. Simply white, simply pure. The luminescent emission of certain common lunar minerals, particularly certain calcium-rich and aluminum-rich minerals that are abundant on the moon's surface, produces emission spectra in the near ultraviolet and visible blue-white range. Not warm like incandescent light, not tinted like filtered sunlight, white, tending toward blue-white in the spectral character of the emission. The Sumerians described Nana's own light as pure white. They were not making up a poetic color association. They were describing the actual spectral character of the moon's luminescent emission, which they would have had no way to determine instrumentally and no way to guess at from casual observation of the moon's appearance. The pure white description, the cold fire description, the below the warmth of gold description, all converge on a consistent spectral characterization of the moon's intrinsic luminescent output that matches what instrumental analysis of lunar luminescence actually finds. White to blue-white emission, spectrally distinct from reflected sunlight, cool rather than warm in its thermal properties. The Sumerians describe this accurately, across multiple text families, in consistent terms that form a coherent spectral picture. That is not coincidence, that is knowledge. The calibration evidence extends into an area of the Sumerian texts that mainstream scholarship has treated entirely as theological, the descriptions of what happens when Nana fails to maintain the correct measure of the phases. The texts are not vague about the consequences. They describe specific types of disorder that result from miscalibration of the moon's schedule. Agricultural failures, floods that arrive out of season, confusion in the movements of other celestial bodies, illness in the livestock that normally respond to the moon's cycle. These are not abstract theological punishments for cosmic disorder. They are specific, observable consequences of a moon whose phase cycle has deviated from the correct schedule. The agricultural failures described as consequences of phase miscalibration are consistent with what would actually happen if the moon's tidal influence on groundwater and soil moisture were disrupted. If the moon's gravitational pull were to vary in its schedule relative to the growing cycles of crops, the water availability at the root zone would be thrown off its regular pattern, producing either drought stress or waterlogging at critical growth stages depending on the direction of the deviation. Flood patterns that arrive out of season are a direct consequence of tidal miscalibration. Since the moon's regular tidal influence on river flooding patterns is a real phenomenon, particularly in the Tigris-Euphrates system where the Sumerians lived, where annual flooding cycles were closely tied to a combination of snowmelt, rainfall, and tidal effects in the Persian Gulf at the river's mouth. A moon whose phase cycle deviated from the correct schedule would produce tidal effects at the wrong times relative to the river system's other flood triggers, potentially compounding or counteracting floods in ways that would be unpredictable and damaging to agriculture. The Sumerian texts describing the consequences of phase miscalibration are, when read against the physical reality of what the moon's regular tidal influence actually does for Earth's agricultural systems, astonishingly specific. They are not describing abstract cosmic punishment. They are describing real, identifiable physical consequences of a change in the moon's phase timing. They understood the causal chain well enough to describe the downstream effects accurately. That level of understanding is not available from watching the moon from the surface. It requires a theoretical model of how the moon's phase cycle interacts with hydrological and agricultural systems, and that model is what the Anunnaki provided. The Sumerians knew this. They described it. They listed it among the consequences of phase miscalibration. And they were right about it, in ways that required a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the moon's light cycle and the biology of the animals whose behavioral rhythms were entrained to that cycle. The dark moon period texts, the descriptions of what Nana does during the 3 days of lunar absence, contain a level of operational detail that has received surprisingly little attention from scholars outside the ancient astronaut framework, perhaps because the operational language is so direct that it is uncomfortable to acknowledge within the purely theological reading. A maintenance review of the mechanisms that produce the scheduled output during a scheduled downtime period, before resuming operations. This is the description of preventive maintenance on a complex system. The dark moon period, when the moon is not visible from Earth's surface, is the scheduled maintenance window during which the systems that produce the moon's output are reviewed, calibrated, and corrected before the next operational cycle begins. The 28-day cycle receives specific treatment in the Sumerian texts that goes beyond simple observation of the lunar month. The texts describe the 28-day cycle as having been precisely set, not as a natural consequence of orbital mechanics, but as the deliberate result of the installation parameters. The moon was placed at its specific distance from Earth so that its orbital period would produce a 28-day cycle. The distance was chosen. The distance was set. The result, the 28-day month, was the intended output of a designed placement. This description inverts the conventional understanding of the relationship between the moon's orbital distance and its orbital period. In the conventional understanding, the moon's orbit has the period it has because it is at the distance it is, and the distance is a consequence of the physics of the giant impact event that created the moon. The period is not the goal. The period is the result of the physics. In the Sumerian description, the period is the goal. The moon was placed at the distance required to produce the desired period. The physics was managed to produce the desired outcome. The Sumerian texts describe the 28-day cycle as having been set, as having been chosen. As the intended result of Nana's installation in his station, they describe the synchronization with human biological cycles as part of the design. Nana is specifically associated with fertility, with the reproductive cycles of women and animals, not merely as a deity who happens to be associated with these things through poetic connection, but as the direct cause of the cycle lengths that govern reproduction. His month is the measure. His phase schedule is what living things are timed to. The synchronization is not coincidental in the Sumerian framework. It is intentional. That is either an extraordinary coincidence between poetic theological thinking and biological reality, or it is a description of a design feature of an installation that was built with that design in mind. The fourth category of Sumerian lunar description deals with what we call the phases of the moon, and the way the Sumerians describe those phases is where the already strained mainstream interpretation begins to show its deepest fractures. Every culture that has ever existed has noticed that the moon changes shape across a monthly cycle. The waxing crescent becomes the half moon, becomes the gibbous moon, becomes the full moon, and then the process reverses. This much is simple observation. Any culture with eyes could record it, and most did. The interesting question is not whether they noticed the phases, it is how they understood them. Modern science understands lunar phases as a geometry problem. The moon orbits the Earth. As it does, the angle between the moon, the Earth, and the sun changes. The half of the moon that faces the sun is always illuminated. The half that faces away is always dark. What changes, from our perspective on Earth, is how much of the illuminated half we can see, depending on where the moon is in its orbit relative to our line of sight to it. New moon is when the moon is between the Earth and the sun, with its dark side facing us. Full moon is when the Earth is between the moon and the sun, with the moon's fully illuminated side facing us. The phases are a consequence of orbital geometry and the directional nature of the sun's illumination. The Sumerians did not describe the phases this way, and their description is not merely metaphorical in contrast to the modern geometric model. Their description implies a specific physical mechanism for the phases that is different from, and in certain respects contradicts, the pure reflection model. In the Sumerian texts, Nana does not simply move through phases as a consequence of orbital geometry and the sun's angle of illumination. Nana actively manages his phases. They are described as deliberate. They are described as scheduled. They are described as something Nana decides to do according to a plan, according to a design that was established for him when he was placed in his station. The word used in the texts for the schedule by which the phases proceed is the Sumerian term mi-tum, which scholars have rendered as appointment or destiny or decree, but which, in its usage across Sumerian administrative texts, means something closer to work schedule. The planned rotation of duties assigned to a worker. Nana follows his mi-tum. His phases are his work schedule. This is described in purely administrative language because Sumerian theological texts are full of administrative language. The gods manage the world the way a Sumerian city-state manages its operations. They have assignments. They have schedules. They report to superior authorities. The language of the divine bureaucracy saturates the literature. So, when the phases of the moon are described as Nana's mi-tum, this could easily be read as the Sumerians importing their administrative understanding of the world onto a natural phenomenon, making the moon's phases into a job rather than a natural process. Except the mi-tum for Nana's phases contains specific content. It is not simply that the phases are Nana's scheduled work. It is that the specific intervals, the timing of the quarter phases, the full moon, the disappearance phase, all of these are described as having been set in the original moment of Nana's installation in his station. They were established then. They have been maintained since. And they are described as being maintained, not passively, not as a consequence of orbital mechanics that simply continue because physics requires them to, but actively, by Nana's ongoing management, by his crew's ongoing operation. The hymn to Nana's journey contains a passage describing what happens in the 3 days before the new moon, the period of lunar absence called the Itu Sig, or dark moon period. During this period, Nana is described as entering the underworld, the realm of the dead, the place below the horizon. And while he is there, he performs specific functions. He makes decisions about who will die in the coming month. He reviews the records of the previous month. He adjusts the mi-tum for the coming cycle if adjustments are needed. Then he returns, and the new crescent appears, and the cycle continues. The key word there is adjustments. If needed, the phrase in the Sumerian is something like, if the counting of the days should have deviated from the correct measure, the great Nana restores the correct measure before he emerges again. This is remarkable. The phases are not only scheduled, they are monitored for accuracy, and if they deviate from the correct measure, they are corrected. Nana does not simply passively move through his phases because orbital mechanics require it. He actively ensures that the phases are proceeding according to the correct schedule, and he corrects them if they are not. Why would a real, natural phenomenon need to be corrected? Why would orbital mechanics need management? They don't. They operate according to the laws of physics without supervision. If the moon's phases were purely the result of orbital geometry and reflected sunlight, there would be nothing to correct. The phases would always be accurate because they would be a direct consequence of physical law. But if the moon's phases were produced by a mechanism, by an active system, designed to produce a specific schedule of light and dark, then that system could potentially deviate from the correct schedule. It could require monitoring. It could require adjustment. And the being responsible for operating that system would need to perform exactly the functions the Sumerian texts describe Nana performing during the dark moon period. The alternative model the texts seem to be describing is one in which the moon's phases are not purely the result of orbital geometry and reflected sunlight. They are partly or significantly the result of an active system that manages the distribution of the moon's light output, including its intrinsic light, according to a schedule. The orbital geometry is real, but it is not the complete explanation. The moon also has a system that controls how much light it emits at any given phase, augmenting or modifying the geometric reflection to produce a specific, designed cycle. This is not what physics currently proposes, but it is what the texts describe. And there is one additional detail from the phase descriptions that makes the maintenance language more pointed rather than less. The Sumerian texts are aware of the irregularities in the lunar cycle. They know that the moon's phases do not repeat with perfect precision. The length of the lunar month varies slightly. The time between full moons is not always exactly the same. Modern astronomy measures this variation and accounts for it through the distinction between the synodic month, the time from new moon to new moon relative to the sun, and the sidereal month, the time it takes the moon to complete one orbit relative to the stars, and the varying effects of the moon's elliptical orbit on its apparent velocity. The Sumerians did not have this framework, but they knew the irregularities existed, and they described them specifically as deviations that required correction. That is a strange thing to know if you understand the phases as pure reflection of a natural orbit. Irregular orbits do not need correction. They are what they are. But if the phases are being produced by a managed system, then irregularities in that system's output are genuinely deviations from the intended schedule. They are failures to maintain the mitum, and the system operator would need to address them. The Sumerian description of Nana correcting the measure of the phases during the dark moon period is, in the context of a managed system model, a perfect description of calibration, a maintenance cycle in which the operator of a system checks whether the system's output has drifted from the target specification and makes adjustments to bring it back into alignment. Calibration. That is what the dark moon period is in the Sumerian description. A scheduled calibration interval for the system that produces the moon's light cycle. If the moon is a natural body, this description is mythological elaboration of a real observation, the moon disappearing and reappearing, translated into theological language of the god entering the underworld and returning. That reading is available, and many scholars take it. But if the moon is not a fully natural body, if it is a constructed or heavily modified object with active systems, then the description is accurate. The calibration is real. The maintenance schedule is real. Nana, whoever or whatever he is in the operational sense, really does need to check and adjust the system during the new moon period to ensure the phases proceed according to the design. The fifth description makes the constructed object model even harder to avoid, because it deals with the moon's interior, and what the Sumerians said about the moon's interior is something that mainstream science spent most of the 20th century insisting was impossible, until the Apollo seismometers proved it was not. The Sumerian texts describe the inside of the boat of heaven. They describe it as hollow. Not hollow in the sense of a metaphorical emptiness, not hollow in the way that the underworld was hollow, not hollow as a symbolic space. Hollow in the sense of having interior chambers, an inside that is separated from the outside by a surface, an interior that contains things, specifically the systems that the crew operates, the mechanisms that produce the boat's light, the instruments that the communication crew uses to send messages to the earth below. The texts describe the crew as dwelling within the boat, not on top of it, not alongside it, not in its metaphorical embrace. Inside it, moving through its interior chambers, performing their functions in spaces that are described as having walls, floors, corridors, chambers of specific purpose. The boat is large enough to contain not merely a crew, but an entire operational infrastructure. Large enough, in some text families, to contain the residences of Nana and his divine family, who are described as living within the boat during certain phases of the journey. This is very specific physical description, and it directly implies that the object being described is hollow, that it has a significant interior volume, that it is not a solid object. Now, what does modern science say about the moon's interior? Until the Apollo missions, the assumption was that the moon was a solid body, roughly similar in internal structure to the Earth, with perhaps a small core, a mantle, and a crust. Dense. Solid. The kind of object you would expect from the giant impact model of lunar formation, where debris coalesces under gravity into a coherent mass. The Apollo seismometers told a different story. When the Apollo 12 lunar module ascent stage was intentionally crashed into the moon's surface, the seismic network detected the impact and recorded the moon's response. What it recorded was not the response of a dense, solid body. The moon, as one NASA scientist memorably put it, rang like a bell. The vibrations continued for nearly an hour. In a truly solid, dense body like Earth, seismic vibrations from an impact of that scale would have damped out in a matter of minutes, absorbed by the dense interior material. Instead, the moon resonated. The vibrations propagated and continued in a pattern consistent with a body that has significant hollow or near-hollow regions in its interior. Subsequent impacts, both deliberate and natural, confirm the pattern. The moon rings. It resonates with a persistence that is anomalous for a body of its mass and composition if that body were solid. The most straightforward physical explanation for the ringing behavior is that the moon has a much lower density interior than its exterior composition would suggest, with regions of significantly reduced material density that allow vibrations to propagate and sustain rather than being absorbed. The hollow moon hypothesis, proposed by Soviet scientists Mikhail Vasin and Alexander Sherbakov in a 1970 paper published in the journal Sputnik, took this evidence further and suggested that the moon might be a largely hollow object with a solid shell, pointing to the bell-ringing seismic behavior as the primary evidence. This hypothesis has never been mainstream, and it has been subjected to significant criticism based on models of how such an object could have formed and maintained its structural integrity. But it has also never been definitively refuted, and the seismic data that motivated it remains what it is, evidence that the moon's interior is not what a standard solid rock formation model would predict. That you are still watching this tells me everything about why this content exists. The official narrative is comfortable. The mainstream dismissal is easy. But you are not here for comfort or ease. You are here because you have read enough and thought enough to know that the comfortable narrative has too many holes in it, and the holes cluster in exactly the places where the Sumerian texts are most detailed and most precise. Stay with us through the final two descriptions, because the 7th and 8th are where the convergence between what the Sumerians recorded and what modern science has confirmed or is now beginning to investigate becomes impossible to explain away. Subscribe if you have not already. This channel exists to ask the questions the official institutions prefer not to answer, and the answer to the question of how the Sumerians knew what they knew about the moon requires asking the question that comes before it. Who told them? The Sumerians described the interior of the moon's boat as hollow, chambered, large enough to contain an operational infrastructure and living spaces. This is not the description of a solid rock. This is the description of a constructed object with designed interior spaces. The bell-ringing behavior of the moon, its anomalous seismic resonance, is consistent with an object that has significant hollow interior regions. The Sumerian description of the boat of heaven as a hollow, chambered vessel is consistent with an object that has significant hollow interior regions. These two descriptions, one ancient and textual, one modern and instrumental, are describing the same physical reality through different frameworks. Neither proves the other. The seismic data does not prove the Sumerians were right about the moon being a constructed vessel. The Sumerian texts do not prove the moon is hollow in the structural sense the seismology suggests, but they are pointing in the same direction, and they are doing so through independent routes of observation separated by 4,000 years. The probability that this convergence is coincidental decreases with each additional area of agreement, and there are more areas of agreement to examine. The interior descriptions in the Sumerian texts do not stop at hollow chambers. They describe what is inside those chambers. The mechanisms, the systems, the instruments. Specific text passages describe specific functions of specific interior systems in ways that, while using Sumerian theological language, carry a clear physical content. One category of interior system is described as the source of the cold fire. The light that the boat produces from within itself, the intrinsic gleaming described in the third category of Sumerian description, comes from a specific interior location. The texts describe it as a chamber deep within the boat where a fire burns without burning, where the gleaming is produced, where the crew who operate it never touch the fire directly but manage it through specific instruments. The fire that burns without burning, that produces cold light, that is managed rather than tended, is described as the heart of the boat, the source from which all the boat's activities draw their power. The heart of the boat. A central energy source that produces cold light and powers all of the vessel's systems, managed by instruments, never touched directly. The parallel to a reactor is not something that requires imagination to draw. It is the direct physical meaning of the description. A contained energy source, producing radiation rather than heat, managed by instruments that prevent direct contact because direct contact would be dangerous, powering all of the vessel's systems. The Sumerians did not have the vocabulary of nuclear physics, but they described the functional behavior of a nuclear power source with accuracy that should not have been available to them unless they were told. The interior description extends to the navigation systems. The boat's path is described as being managed by mechanisms within the hull, not by external forces like wind or current. The crew member designated as path monitor operates interior systems that maintain the boat on its correct trajectory. These systems are described as responding to the positions of specific stars, using them as reference points to calculate and correct the boat's position. Celestial navigation using star positions as fixed reference points to calculate position and maintain trajectory. This is how spacecraft navigate today, not by wind, not by current. By reference to fixed celestial objects and the mathematics of trajectory correction based on those references, the Sumerians described all of this, not as metaphor. As the operating procedures of a specific vehicle in a specific location in the sky, the hollow moon evidence from the Apollo program is not limited to the bell-ringing resonance of the ascent stage impact. It is a cumulative body of data from multiple sources that has consistently pointed at the same anomalous conclusion, namely that the moon's interior does not match what a standard solid rock body of its mass and surface composition should look like from the inside. The moon's moment of inertia factor, a measurement of how mass is distributed within a body, is anomalous for a moon of its composition. For a solid rocky body with roughly uniform density throughout, the moment of inertia factor falls within a predictable range. The moon's factor is lower than this range would predict. suggesting that the moon's mass is more concentrated toward its surface than its interior, consistent with an object that has less dense material in its interior than at its surface. A hollow or near-hollow interior with a denser shell would produce exactly this distribution. The moon's bulk density, the average density of the entire moon, is lower than the surface rock density measured directly from Apollo samples. The surface rocks are denser than the moon as a whole. This means the interior material is on average less dense than the surface material. In a solid rocky body formed by the coalescence of similar material throughout, you would expect broadly consistent density across the body, with perhaps some differentiation due to differentiation of heavy elements toward the core under gravity. The moon shows the opposite pattern, a denser surface and a less dense interior. This is again consistent with a hollow or near-hollow interior with a dense shell. The engineering implications of a hollow moon are what mainstream science has focused on in its objection to the hollow moon hypothesis. How could such an object form? What process could hollow out a moon-sized body and leave it structurally intact? The standard models of planetary formation do not produce hollow bodies. Gravity compresses material toward the center. Impact events break things. They do not hollow them. Natural processes do not produce hollow moons. The texts describing the interior of the boat of heaven are not random in their specificity. The types of chambers described map onto the operational functions described elsewhere in the texts. There are chambers for the energy system, matching the description of the cold fire at the boat's heart. There are chambers for the navigation and communication systems, matching the crew function descriptions. There are storage chambers for the materials in transit, matching the logistical function of the lunar way station. There are residential spaces for the crew and for Nana and his family, matching the descriptions of the Anunnaki as inhabiting the lunar installation during their periods of Earth management. The organizational structure of the described interior is consistent with a purpose-built operational facility, not a natural geological formation that happens to have been inhabited. The chambers serve specific functions. The corridors connect the chambers to each other in ways that facilitate the operations performed in them. The placement of the central energy chamber, described as being in the deep interior of the boat, shielded from the outer hull, is consistent with the containment requirements for an energy system that produces radiation that the crew must be protected from, shielded from the outer hull. The inner chamber, the one containing the cold fire, the one whose operators work with instruments rather than touching it directly, is specifically described as being shielded by additional material, placed in the deep interior rather than near the surface, surrounded by additional layers between it and the outer hull. This is a description of radiation shielding for a nuclear equivalent power source. The most dangerous component of the installation is placed in the most protected location, surrounded by mass to absorb the radiation, accessed only through specialized instruments that allow the operators to manage it from a safe distance. The Sumerians described this. In a text describing the interior of a theological construct, a boat for a moon god, they described radiation shielding for a central energy source. They described it accurately. Deep interior placement, additional surrounding material, operators using instruments rather than direct contact. This is not a description that emerges from Bronze Age imagination. This is a description that emerges from knowledge of a real system, transmitted to people who understood the basic principles even if they could not have derived those principles independently. The connection to the hollow moon seismic evidence is direct. A moon with significant hollow interior regions, confirmed by Apollo seismic data, matches the Sumerian description of the boat of heaven as a hollow vessel with organized interior spaces. The specific seismic anomaly, the bell-ringing resonance, is exactly what you would expect from a large, hollow, metallic or partially metallic shell structure. Stone rings differently from metal. A thin metallic shell around a large hollow space would ring very differently from a solid rock body. The moon's bell-ringing behavior, its extraordinary seismic resonance, is the acoustic signature of a hollow, possibly metallic structure. The Sumerian texts describe exactly that structure. The sixth description of the moon in Sumerian texts is the one that produces the strangest combination of scientific validation and ongoing mystery, and it begins with something that sounds straightforwardly absurd until you look at the evidence. The Sumerians describe the moon as making sound. Not in a metaphorical sense, not in the sense that priests and musicians made music in honor of the moon, not in the sense that the cycles of the moon marked the rhythm of life in a poetic way. The moon itself, the object in the sky, was described as producing sound, as having a voice. Nana's voice is described in multiple texts as something that could be heard from the Earth's surface, not as the voice of a priest speaking in his name, but as the voice of Nana himself, transmitted from his position in the sky to the ears of those below. The mainstream interpretation is immediate and confident. The moon's voice is the voice of the moon deity speaking to his people, a common religious metaphor across many traditions, the divine voice that speaks through natural phenomena like wind and water and thunder. It is theology, not acoustics. But the specific language of the Nana voice descriptions is not the language of theological metaphor, it is operational language. The voice of Nana is described in the same terms as the communications function of the boat's crew, the me of transmission, the sending across distance, the message received on the surface. The voice is described as having specific qualities. It is described as below hearing, meaning below the range of normal human hearing, but felt rather than heard, transmitted through the earth and through the bodies of those who stand upon it. Felt rather than heard. Below hearing, transmitted through solid material. This is infrasound, low-frequency sound, below approximately 20 Hz, which is the lower limit of typical human hearing, but which is transmitted efficiently through solid materials and can be felt as vibration by the human body. Infrasound is produced by natural phenomena, including earthquakes, ocean waves, atmospheric disturbances, and certain geological processes. It is also produced by the moon, specifically through the tidal interactions between the moon's gravitational field and the Earth's geological structure. The tidal flexing of the Earth's crust, the movement of rock under tidal gravitational stress, produces low-frequency vibrations in the infrasonic range. The moon makes the Earth ring, not just metaphorically, but in a literal seismic sense. Every time the moon passes overhead, the Earth's crust responds to the gravitational gradient with measurable flexing. That flexing produces vibration. That vibration propagates through the solid Earth. It is below the range of normal hearing. It is felt rather than heard by those standing on the surface. It is transmitted through solid material, through the Earth itself, and through the bodies that stand upon it. The Sumerians described this. They described a voice from Nana that was below hearing, felt through the Earth, transmitted to those standing on the surface. They attributed specific effects to this voice, including agricultural effects relating to crop growth, emotional effects relating to the behavior of living creatures, and what they described as the opening of the waters, a reference to tidal effects that will be addressed in the 7th description. All of these effects, the agricultural sensitivity to lunar cycles, the behavioral responses of living creatures to the moon's position, the tidal response of bodies of water, are real phenomena with documented physical causes, all related to the moon's gravitational influence. The Sumerians packaged all of them together under the description of Nana's voice, his sound, his transmission to the Earth, and they described it with physical accuracy. Below hearing, felt rather than heard, transmitted through solid material, causing measurable effects on living things and on bodies of water. How does a civilization without seismometers, without instruments capable of measuring infrasound, without any theoretical framework for the distinction between audible and inaudible sound waves, come to describe the moon's gravitational acoustic influence on Earth with this accuracy? The answer cannot be naked eye observation. You cannot observe infrasound with your eyes. You cannot determine that the Earth's vibrations are below hearing without the ability to compare them to audible sounds using calibrated instruments. You cannot connect the tidal behavior of water to a sound transmitted through the Earth from the moon's gravitational pull without a theoretical framework that connects these phenomena. You can describe what you are told, and if you are told, by beings who have instruments and theoretical frameworks you do not have, that the moon transmits a voice below hearing that moves through the Earth and causes these effects, you record what you were told, in the language available to you. With a theological framework that makes sense of beings who communicate at long range across the boundary between sky and surface, the voice of Nana is infrasound. It is gravitationally generated. It is transmitted through solid material. And the Sumerians knew this, but the sound description in the Sumerian texts extends beyond infrasound, beyond the moon's gravitational effects on Earth's geology. There is another category of sonic description associated with the boat of heaven itself, not with the voice transmitted through the Earth, but with the sound produced by the boat in the sky. This sound is described in a smaller number of texts, mostly from the earlier periods of Sumerian civilization, and it is described in terms that are harder to parse, but equally specific. The boat's own sound is described as a humming, a low, continuous vibration produced by the mechanisms within the hull, the operating signature of the systems that drive the boat's movement and produce its light. This sound is not transmitted to the Earth, as infrasound is. It is described as audible only at close range, to those who approach the boat or are within it. The crew member who works nearest the central mechanism, the one who tends the systems in the inner chamber, is described as accustomed to the hum, as having learned not to be disturbed by it in the way newcomers to the boat were disturbed when they first heard it. A continuously operating mechanism producing a characteristic low hum. Operating systems that produce a sound signature detectable at close range. This is a description of a machine's operational acoustic signature, the sound that any complex mechanical or electromechanical system produces simply by functioning. Every spacecraft carries operating systems that produce vibration and sound within their structures. Pumps, power systems, thermal management systems. All of these produce acoustic signatures, vibrations that propagate through the structure, sounds that crew members who spend time aboard the vehicle come to recognize and take for granted. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this. The hum of the boat of heaven, familiar to its long-term crew, disturbing to newcomers, produced by the central mechanism, continuous during operation. This is not the voice that transmits to the earth. This is the internal acoustic signature of a functioning vessel. The two-track sonic description, the transmitted low-frequency voice reaching the surface, and the internal hum known to the crew, is a precise match for the acoustic profile of a vehicle in operation. The outer, transmitted sound is the gravitational acoustic effect of the moon's tidal interaction with Earth. The inner hum is the operational signature of the vessel's propulsion and power systems. Neither of these descriptions is available through naked-eye observation of the moon from the surface of the Earth. Both require either direct experience within or near the vehicle, or the testimony of those who had that experience. The Sumerians recorded both, accurately. In terms that, stripped of their theological framing, describe real acoustic phenomena associated with the moon and with a large orbiting vehicle. The infrasound phenomenon associated with the moon is more extensively documented in modern research than is generally appreciated in public discourse. The field of infrasound monitoring, developed primarily for the purpose of detecting nuclear tests and large-scale atmospheric events, has produced a significant body of data on the background infrasound environment of the Earth, and that data consistently shows correlations with the moon's position and phase. The tidal strain on the Earth's crust, produced by the moon's differential gravitational pull across the diameter of the Earth, generates stress in the geological formations that make up the crust and upper mantle. That stress produces fractures, microfractures, and the movement of fluid-filled rock systems, all of which generate acoustic emission in the very low frequency range. The acoustic emission from tidal strain is continuous, not limited to major seismic events, and it propagates through the Earth in ways that are detectable with sensitive instruments. It is part of the background acoustic signature of the planet, and it varies with the moon's orbital position. The Sumerians described the effects of Nana's voice in terms that include awe, a sense of the divine presence, heightened awareness, and what the texts describe as the opening of inner perception. These are experiential descriptions of the actual psychological effects of low-frequency infrasound on human subjects. The Sumerians were not imagining a divine voice. They were experiencing a real infrasonic phenomenon, attributing it to its correct source, the moon's gravitational interaction with the Earth's geology, and describing its real effects on human physiology and psychology with accuracy that has only recently been independently confirmed. The internal hum of the boat of heaven adds another acoustic dimension. The operating signature of a large vessel's mechanical systems is not limited to the simple background hum of its running machinery. Complex operational systems produce characteristic acoustic signatures that skilled operators learn to interpret diagnostically. A change in the pitch or quality of the hum indicates a change in the system's operation. An unusual vibration indicates a component operating outside its normal parameters. The crew of an operational vessel learn to hear and interpret their vessel's acoustic signature as a continuous diagnostic readout of the vessel's condition. The Sumerian texts describe exactly this. The inner chamber operators are described as knowing the sound of the mechanisms, of being familiar with its regular quality, and of noticing when the quality changes. When the hum changes, something has changed in the mechanism. This is the description of acoustic diagnostic monitoring by experienced crew. It is not the description of theological symbolism. It is the description of people doing their jobs, maintaining a complex system by listening to it as well as by reading their instruments, using the acoustic signature of the operating machinery as one source of diagnostic information. The implication of this description is that the boat of heaven systems were not silent. They produced a characteristic sound that varied with their operating state. The crew monitored that sound. This is exactly what you would expect from a large, complex operational installation running powerful mechanical or electromagnetic systems. The energy system, the navigation systems, the life support systems, the communications equipment, all of these would produce mechanical vibration, electromagnetic radiation, and thermal fluctuations that would propagate through the vessel's structure as acoustic energy. The crew would hear this, feel it through the deck and walls, and use it as diagnostic information. The Sumerians described this accurately, in a context that should have been entirely outside their experience. They had never operated complex machinery. They had no ships with engine rooms. They had no facilities with operating power systems. And yet the acoustic description of the boat of heaven's operating signature, the familiar hum known to the crew, is the kind of description that comes from direct experience, or from the testimony of those who had direct experience. Someone who had been inside an operating spacecraft or who had been told about it by someone who had would describe it this way. The convergence of the external infrasonic voice and the internal operational hum in a single tradition's description of the moon's acoustic properties is itself a significant point. Other cultures that describe moon gods and their properties do not make this distinction. They describe the moon's influence, they describe its voice in a general metaphorical sense, but they do not separately describe an external low-frequency vibration transmitted through solid Earth from the moon's gravitational interaction with the planet, and an internal operational hum audible only to crew members inside the moon vehicle. That specific, technically coherent two-track acoustic description is uniquely Sumerian in its precision, and it suggests that the Sumerian tradition preserved both pieces of information: the externally observable gravitational acoustic effect and the internally observable mechanical acoustic signature, from a source that had direct knowledge of both. The seventh category of Sumerian lunar description is the one that 20th century science was most certain the Sumerians could not have understood. And it is also the one where the modern confirmation is most complete, most quantified, and most unambiguous. The Sumerians understood the moon's gravitational effects on Earth's oceans. They understood it in specific terms. Not in the vague and general sense that the moon and the tides are somehow connected, which is an observation available to any culture living near a coastline who bothers to pay attention to the timing of tidal cycles. They understood it mechanically. They described the moon as pulling the waters. They described the mechanism as a force, using the Sumerian word niggig, which translates most directly as the compelling power, or the force that compels, used elsewhere in the texts for the authority of a king that cannot be resisted, the decree that must be obeyed. Nana's niggig acts upon the waters and the waters obey it. They rise when Nana commands. They fall when his attention moves elsewhere. The language of command and obedience is theological. The force being described is gravitational. And the specifics of how the Sumerians described that force go well beyond the simple observation that tides correlate with lunar cycles. The most detailed treatment of the moon-tide relationship in Sumerian texts is found in the hymn to Nana as Lord of the Seas, a composition preserved in fragments across multiple tablet archives that deals specifically with Nana's authority over ocean behavior. The text describes the manner in which Nana's niggig acts on the great waters, and the description includes several features that require explanation from a physics standpoint. First, the text specifies that the pulling force acts on the whole of the great waters, not only the surface. The force reaches through the depth of the sea, from the surface to the bottom, affecting the movement of the entire body of water, not merely the surface waves or the surface tidal bulge. This is physically correct. The moon's gravitational influence on ocean water is not purely a surface phenomenon. The tidal bulge involves the movement of a substantial volume of water, with effects throughout the water column, not only at the surface. Second, the text describes 2 points of the great waters rising at the same time, in 2 different places on the Earth, in a manner that seems to contradict straightforward observation. If you are watching from a single location, the tide rises and falls. You do not observe that the tide is rising simultaneously in another location on the opposite side of the Earth. But the Sumerian text specifically describes the double nature of Nana's pull, his niggig drawing the waters toward him in one place, while simultaneously drawing the waters in the great behind place, which is the Sumerian term for what we would call the antipodal point, the point on the opposite side of the Earth from the moon. This is the double tidal bulge. It is one of the genuinely counterintuitive features of tidal mechanics. People across cultures, thinking about tides, imagine a single bulge of water on the side of the Earth closest to the moon, pulled toward it by gravity. But there are 2 tidal bulges, one on the near side and one on the far side. The near side bulge is caused by the moon pulling the water toward it. The far side bulge is caused by the moon pulling the solid Earth toward it faster than it pulls the distant water, leaving the water on the far side effectively behind. It is an inertial effect, the same principle that keeps satellites in orbit rather than falling straight down. The existence of the double tidal bulge is not something you can observe with your eyes from a single location on Earth. You cannot see the far side bulge from where you stand. You need a global perspective to understand tides as a double bulge phenomenon. or you need the mathematics of gravitational mechanics applied to a rotating body and a secondary gravitational source. The Sumerians had neither a global satellite perspective nor Newtonian mechanics, but they described the double tidal bulge correctly, in terms that map precisely onto the actual physics of how the moon causes tides on a spherical Earth with water on its surface. The only way to know about the far side tidal bulge without modern instrumentation is to either have conducted global observations of tidal behavior across many different points on the Earth's surface simultaneously, or to have a theoretical understanding of the gravitational mechanics involved, or to have been told by someone who already had that understanding. The first is not realistic for a Bronze Age civilization, even a sophisticated one. The second requires a level of mathematical physics that the Sumerians are not credited with. The third requires only that the Anunnaki, who the texts consistently describe as the source of Sumerian astronomical and mathematical knowledge, actually understood gravitational mechanics. The texts describe the Anunnaki as coming from another planet, as beings who traveled between worlds. Any civilization capable of interplanetary travel would necessarily have developed a sophisticated understanding of gravitational mechanics, because orbital mechanics is the fundamental physics of interplanetary travel. Calculating a trajectory between two planets requires solving gravitational equations of considerable complexity. If the Anunnaki could travel between Nibiru, their homeworld described in the texts, and Earth, they understood gravitational mechanics at a level that would trivially include the tidal physics of a moon's effect on a planet's oceans. The third option, that the Sumerians were told about the double tidal bulge by beings who understood orbital mechanics, is the most parsimonious explanation for their accurate description of it. The third feature of the Sumerian tidal description is the most technically specific of all, and it is the one that most clearly distinguishes genuine knowledge of tidal mechanics from mere observation of local tidal patterns. The hymn to Nana as Lord of the Seas describes the timing of the tidal cycle in terms that explicitly account for the difference between the moon's orbital period and the Earth's rotational period. The text states, in a passage that has required careful translation from multiple scholars, that Nana's pulling comes twice in the Great Counting, not once, and the twice coming is separated by an interval that is not equal, because Nana moves while the Earth beneath him turns, and the turnings do not match the movings in simple numbers. The turnings do not match the movings in simple numbers. The Earth's rotation does not synchronize with the moon's orbital period in whole numbers, which is why the tidal cycle is approximately 12 hours and 25 minutes, rather than exactly 12 hours. The discrepancy, the 25 minutes, is the result of the moon having moved in its orbit during the time it takes the Earth to rotate. The tidal bulge has to chase the moon slightly, which lengthens each tidal cycle beyond a simple half rotation of the Earth. The Sumerians knew this. They described the interval between the twice coming as unequal to half of the Earth's turning, as slightly longer than it would be if the Earth simply turned and Nana stood still. They knew Nana moved, that the moon's orbital motion during each Earth rotation shifted the timing of the tidal cycle in a predictable way. They built this understanding into their description of the tidal mechanism. This level of technical accuracy requires not merely the observation that tides come twice per day and correlate with the moon's position. It requires the ability to measure the precise timing of tidal cycles and compare them to the precise timing of the Earth's rotation, detecting a discrepancy of 25 minutes per cycle, and then connecting that discrepancy to the moon's orbital motion. Without accurate timekeeping instruments, without the ability to measure both rotational and orbital periods with the necessary precision, this knowledge is not derivable from simple observation. The Sumerians had a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between tidal timing and the moon's orbital motion that is encoded in their theological descriptions. The theological framing is Sumerian. The physics is correct. The seventh description adds one more layer that goes beyond tidal mechanics into an area of active scientific research that is barely a generation old. The Sumerian texts describe Nana's Niggig as affecting not only the great waters of the sea, but also the waters within the Earth, the hidden waters that move through stone and fill the deep spaces beneath the surface. The moon's compelling force acts on underground water, on the water table, on the movement of water through permeable rock layers. This is not tidal mechanics in the classical sense. This is the lunar influence on groundwater movement, on the behavior of aquifers and subsurface water flows, on the pressure of water within deep geological formations. It is a real phenomenon. Research conducted from the late 20th century onward has documented that the moon's gravitational influence produces measurable effects on groundwater levels, on the pressure within deep aquifers, and on the movement of subsurface fluids. The same tidal forces that act on oceans act on any fluid body, including the water stored within and moving through the Earth's crust. The effects are smaller and slower than ocean tides, but they are measurable and real, and the Sumerians described them. They described Nana's force acting on the deep waters, the hidden waters, the waters within stone. They attributed to this force effects on agriculture, specifically on the availability of water for crops in regions not directly adjacent to rivers or seas, suggesting an awareness that the moon's influence on subsurface water affected the water available to growing plants through root systems that reach into the groundwater layer. This is a description of a real causal chain. Moon's gravity, subsurface water pressure fluctuation, root zone water availability, crop growth effects. The Sumerians encoded this entire chain in the description of Nana's Nig-Gig acting on the hidden waters to benefit the growth of grain. They were not making up poetic connections between a moon god and crop growth. They were recording a real physical mechanism, accurately, in the language available to them. The breadth and precision of the Sumerian tidal and hydrological knowledge is not the work of a civilization that happened to guess correctly about a few things. It is the work of a civilization that was taught, systematically, by teachers who understood the physics of how a large orbiting body interacts gravitationally with a water-bearing planet. Teachers whose knowledge of these mechanics was applied, comprehensive, and accurate. The tidal knowledge in the Sumerian texts has one more dimension that has received almost no attention in the literature, but is, arguably, the most striking of all the specific gravitational insights the texts preserve. The Sumerian texts describe the moon's tidal influence as extending to the movement of air, not just water. The Nig-Gig acts on the upper waters, the lower waters, the hidden waters, and what the texts call the breath of the world, the movement of air masses that we would call the atmosphere. This is a real phenomenon. The moon's gravitational influence does not stop at the ocean surface. The atmosphere, being a fluid, is also subject to tidal forces, and the atmospheric tides produced by the moon and sun are real, measurable phenomena. They are smaller than ocean tides because the atmosphere is far less dense than water, but they are real and they have been measured. The atmospheric tide produces variations in surface pressure at the scale of fractions of a millibar, periodic variations that follow the lunar orbital period. These variations are small compared to other atmospheric pressure variations, but they are detectable with sensitive instruments and have been confirmed in multiple independent studies. The Sumerians described the moon's Nig-Gig acting on the atmosphere. They did not have barometers or pressure sensors. They could not have measured atmospheric pressure variations of this scale directly. But the texts describe Nana's force acting on the breath of the world, the air, the moving masses of the upper region. The consistent Sumerian cosmology places the atmosphere as a region between the earth and the sky, a zone through which the boat of heaven moves, and within which Nana's Nig-Gig operates as it does in the waters below. The moon was understood to affect the air as it affected the water, through the same force, operating on a different medium. This is a correct description of the physics. The same gravitational gradient that produces ocean tides also produces atmospheric tides. The mechanism is identical, the scale is different. The Sumerians described the same mechanism operating on both media, which is physically accurate in a way that required understanding that the moon's force was a general force acting on any fluid medium, not a specific property of water. The agricultural implications of atmospheric tides, while small, are not zero. The slight variations in atmospheric pressure associated with lunar tidal cycles affect humidity patterns, dew formation, and the behavior of atmospheric water at the surface level in ways that interact with plant physiology. The very precise Sumerian agricultural lunar calendar may have incorporated these atmospheric effects in ways that are not obvious from the surface-level description of the instructions, which focus on the timing of planting and harvesting relative to lunar phases, but which may have underlying physical justifications, involving not only groundwater pressure effects, but also the smaller but real atmospheric effects on surface conditions. The Sumerian flood management texts, which include detailed calendars of when floods are expected and when specific agricultural and civil preparations should be made, show an awareness of this lunar tidal hydrological interaction. The calendars are not simply observational records of when floods historically happened. They are predictive, based on principles, and the lunar component of the flood timing predictions reflects an understanding of how the moon's tidal influence at the river's mouth interacts with the upstream flood dynamics. This level of hydrological tidal integration in practical flood management planning is not available from simple observation of past flood events. It requires theoretical understanding of the causal mechanisms. The Sumerians had it. The connection between the Sumerian tidal knowledge and the survival of their civilization is not incidental. The Tigris-Euphrates river system was the foundation of everything, The agricultural productivity that made Sumerian civilization possible depended entirely on managing the relationship between their fields and the river's annual flooding cycle. Getting the timing wrong, planting too early or too late relative to the flood, failing to prepare flood defenses at the right time, was not merely inconvenient, it was existential. The civilization that understood the moon's role in the flood timing most accurately was the civilization that survived. The Sumerians understood it well enough to build a civilization. The knowledge that made that survival possible, the knowledge of how Nana's Nig-Gig interacted with the great waters and the hidden waters and the river mouths where the salt met the fresh, was knowledge they were given by beings who understood it perfectly and transmitted it to the people they had placed on the land between the rivers, because the success of the agricultural operation the Sumerians were created to perform depended on it. The eighth description, the final one, is the one that ties every previous description together and makes the overall picture unmistakable. It is the description that has attracted the most attention from researchers working outside the mainstream framework, and the most dismissal from those working within it, precisely because it brings the overall picture into focus in a way that the other 7 descriptions, individually and collectively, can still be explained away, but which this 8th one makes considerably harder to maintain. The Sumerians described the moon as a way station, a stopping place, a base of operations. Not a destination in itself, but a point between destinations, between the Anunnaki's world, described consistently as a large planet in a long elliptical orbit that brings it close to the inner solar system at long intervals, and Earth. The moon is where the Anunnaki go when they are not on Earth. The moon is where supplies are transferred, where decisions are made, where the management of Earth operations is coordinated. The moon is the hub through which traffic between Earth and Nibiru passes. This description is consistent and extensive across the Sumerian text corpus. It appears in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily on earlier Sumerian source material, in the Atrahasis epic, in the Era and Ishum texts, in the Sumerian king list commentaries, and in the specialized texts dealing directly with Nana and the Boat of Heaven. In all of these contexts, the moon is not merely the home of a lunar deity. It is an operational installation in the solar system, a transit hub, a base from which the Anunnaki manage their Earth operations. The specific functions described for this lunar base are worth examining in detail, because they go beyond the general concept of a way station and describe specific types of activity, each with its own implications. The first function is logistical. The moon is described as receiving materials from Earth that are sent up through what the texts describe as the ascending of loads to the great sky dwelling, the place of Nana's boat. The specific materials most frequently mentioned are metals, particularly gold, which the Anunnaki are described throughout the texts as mining from the Earth and sending off-world. The gold goes to the moon first, then continues to Nibiru. The moon is the transfer point in the logistical chain. The gold mining purpose of the Anunnaki is one of the most discussed elements of the entire Sumerian text corpus. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation that the Anunnaki came to Earth specifically to mine gold for use in saving Nibiru's atmosphere by dispersing gold particles in the upper atmosphere has been extensively debated. Whether or not his specific interpretation is correct, the fact that the Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as engaged in intensive gold extraction from Earth, sending that gold off-world through the moon, is simply what the texts say. It is not Sitchin's invention. The logistical chain, Earth surface mining to lunar transfer to interplanetary destination, is explicitly described. The second function of the lunar way station is administrative. The moon is where decisions about Earth are made, where the Council of Anunnaki meets to determine policies for their Earth operation, where disputes about the management of Earth's populations are resolved. The texts describe regular meetings at the lunar installation, attended by Anunnaki from both Earth and other locations, facilitated by the communication systems described in the Boat of Heaven passages. The moon is not simply a physical way station. It is the administrative center of the Anunnaki Earth operation. This administrative function is why Nana is assigned the moon. He is not merely the moon deity in the sense of a being who personifies a natural phenomenon. He is the administrator of the lunar installation, the one responsible for its operation, for maintaining the communication links between Earth and Nibiru, for managing the transfer of materials and personnel, and for overseeing the scheduled maintenance of the systems that produce the moon's light and manage its gravitational functions in relation to Earth. All of the specific operational details described in the previous descriptions, the calibrated phases, the crew functions, the transmission to Earth, the maintenance schedule, are all aspects of Nana's administrative role as manager of the lunar facility. The third function described for the lunar way station is the one that connects most directly to the human experience of the Anunnaki as described in the texts. The moon is the place from which the Anunnaki observe Earth. The specific language used involves watching, monitoring, the regular assessment of conditions on the surface, the checking of whether the human populations are performing the functions assigned to them, the monitoring of geological conditions, weather patterns, the state of agricultural production. The moon is the observation platform from which the Anunnaki oversee their Earth operation. An observation platform in lunar orbit has an extraordinary advantage for observing Earth's surface. From the moon, every part of Earth's surface comes into view over the course of a lunar orbit. No location is permanently hidden. No development on the surface escapes eventual visibility. The moon provides, for an observer equipped with sufficient optical technology, near-complete surveillance coverage of the entire Earth's surface over a relatively short time period. The Anunnaki texts describe their ability to observe everything that happens on Earth, their awareness of events at great distances, their capacity to know what the human populations were doing. This level of observational access, if taken literally, requires an orbital observation platform. The moon is described as providing that platform. The fourth function is the one that connects back to the very beginning of this investigation, to the first description, the text that referenced the time before the moon. If the moon is a constructed or heavily modified object placed in Earth orbit by the Anunnaki, and if the Anunnaki placed it there for the logistical, administrative, and observational purposes described above, then the question of when it was placed there takes on specific content. It was placed there when the Anunnaki began their Earth operation. Before that operation, there was no moon, or the moon was different, smaller, less significant, not yet configured for its present purposes. The texts that describe the time before the gleaming had been placed in its station, the time before the great counting of the phases had been established, the time before Nana had taken up his dwelling, are all describing the period before the Anunnaki Earth operation was established. The moon was placed there as part of that establishment. Its timing, its phases, its position in Earth's orbital neighborhood, all of these were configured for the purposes of the operation. The stabilization of Earth's axial tilt that the moon provides, a real physical effect that the moon's gravitational influence has on Earth's rotational stability, contributing to the relatively stable climate that allowed advanced life to develop, was not an accidental benefit of a random impact event. It was a designed feature of the installation. This is the full picture the Sumerian texts present, a moon that was not always present. A moon that is a constructed or heavily modified object with active systems. A moon whose light includes its own intrinsic output, managed according to a calibrated schedule. A moon that produces sounds, both the infrasonic vibration transmitted through Earth's geology and the operational hum of its internal systems. A moon whose gravitational influence on Earth's oceans and subsurface hydrology was accurately understood and described. A moon that serves as the logistical hub, administrative center, and observation platform for an ongoing operation conducted by beings who are not from Earth, who came here for specific purposes, who created the human species to serve those purposes, and who used the moon as their base of operations throughout the period of their active presence on Earth. The Sumerian texts are not alone in carrying these descriptions. The Egyptian texts, dealing with Thoth, who shares numerous characteristics with Nana and is sometimes identified as the same being operating under a different name in a different cultural context, contain parallel descriptions of a lunar base of operations. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe the moon as a vessel, as a constructed object, in terms that parallel the Sumerian descriptions in ways that are too specific to be the result of independent mythological invention. The Hopi cosmology of North America contains descriptions of a time before the moon that match the Sumerian descriptions with a precision that suggests a common source of knowledge rather than independent development of a coincidentally similar myth. None of this proves anything in the strict scientific sense. None of it constitutes the kind of falsifiable empirical evidence that mainstream science requires before revising its picture of the moon. The Sumerian texts are not peer-reviewed journals. The translations are disputed in their details. The interpretations require assumptions that many scholars find unjustified. But the convergences are real. The specific physical details that the Sumerians got right, the ones they should not have had access to, the ones that were confirmed only in the 20th century or later, are not the product of imagination or random mythological construction. They are the product of knowledge that came from somewhere. The eighth description, the moon as a way station and base of operations for the Anunnaki, is the one that makes the most sense of all the others. If you accept that the moon is what the Sumerians said it was, not a random accumulation of post-impact debris, but a constructed or modified installation placed in Earth orbit for specific purposes, then the cold fire of its intrinsic light is the operational output of its power systems. The hollow chambers are its interior spaces. The calibrated phases are the scheduled output of its managed light systems. The voice below hearing is the acoustic signature of its gravitational interaction with the tidal force-sensitive geology of Earth below. The crew is the personnel who operate it. The crescent shape is its actual structure. And the time before it existed is the period before the Anunnaki needed it. All 8 descriptions are coherent. All 8 point in the same direction. And the direction they point is not toward mythology. It is toward the conclusion that the Sumerians were not making up their cosmology. They were recording history. History that began before recorded human history, before the development of human civilization, in a time when the moon was placed in the sky by beings who understood exactly what they were doing and why. And who, before they left, told the people they had created everything they needed to know about it. The cross-cultural evidence for the lunar waystation concept deserves careful treatment because the convergences are specific enough to suggest a common source of information rather than independent mythological development, but presenting them requires distinguishing between genuine parallels and superficial similarities that are found in many cultures for structural reasons. The Egyptian evidence is the most well-documented. Thoth, the Egyptian deity of wisdom, writing, magic, and the moon, shares an extraordinary number of specific characteristics with Nana that go beyond the obvious parallels of both being moon deities associated with wisdom and writing. The operational characteristics are where the parallels become striking. Thoth is specifically described as the record keeper of the gods, the one who maintains the accounts, the one who records the passage of time, the one who is responsible for the correct functioning of the celestial cycles. He is described as living on the moon, as operating from the moon, and as performing functions from the lunar position that affect conditions on Earth below. The specific functions, the record-keeping, the time measurement, the mediation between the divine realm and the human realm, the management of knowledge transmission from gods to humans, are identical to the functions described for Nana in the Sumerian texts. The specificity of the parallel extends to a detail that is rarely noted. Both Thoth and Nana are described as being able to communicate with the surface directly from the lunar position without physical messengers, through a mechanism that is described as transmission rather than sending. In both traditions, the moon deity sends communications to Earth through a medium that is not physical travel. The communications arrive without transit time. The mechanism is described in both traditions as involving an instrument or set of instruments specific to the deity and unavailable to ordinary beings. The parallel description of an instantaneous communication mechanism using specialized instruments in 2 independent textual traditions, separated by geography and language, points strongly toward a common source of the information rather than independent mythological invention. The Vedic text called the Shatapatha Brahmana contains a passage describing the moon as a vessel, not metaphorically but in a direct physical sense, a moving vessel in the sky that contains the soma and distributes it according to a schedule. The vessel travels on a fixed path. The path has been set for it. The vessel operates according to principles established at the time of its creation. The soma that it contains and distributes is what gives the gods their strength, what maintains the order of the world, what makes the agricultural cycles possible. The moon, as a vessel operating on a fixed schedule, distributing a physically active substance that maintains world order and agricultural productivity, is structurally identical to the Sumerian description of the boat of heaven and its role in managing Earth systems. The Dogon people of West Africa, famous in alternative history discussions for their apparent knowledge of the Sirius binary star system, also preserve lunar traditions with specific parallels to the Sumerian descriptions. The Dogon describe the moon as an object, using the same category of word they use for manufactured things rather than the category they use for natural features of the landscape. The moon is made. It was placed. It serves a function. The function described in Dogon cosmological tradition includes the regulation of the agricultural calendar, which is also significant in the Dogon farming community, and the role as a stopping place for beings who travel between the stars and the Earth. The moon as a way station for interstellar or interplanetary travelers is a specific concept in Dogon cosmology, not a vague mythological notion, but a practical description of the moon's function in the transportation network of the beings who established human civilization. The being associated with the establishment of Dogon civilization, named Namo in their tradition, is described as having come from another star system, as having used the moon as part of the journey or as part of the Earth management infrastructure, and as having transmitted to the Dogon the knowledge about the sky that forms the basis of their extraordinary astronomical tradition. The parallels with the Anunnaki, as described in the Sumerian texts, are specific, involving interstellar or interplanetary origin, use of the moon as operational infrastructure, transmission of advanced astronomical knowledge to the human population established by these beings. Across Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, North America, and West Africa, the same picture emerges in different cultural clothing. The moon is not simply a natural feature of the sky. It was placed. It serves specific purposes. The beings responsible for placing it came from elsewhere, and were the source of the astronomical and agricultural knowledge of the civilizations that arose under their guidance. The lunar way station concept is not a Sumerian invention. It is a widely distributed piece of information about the actual nature and function of the moon that was transmitted to multiple human populations by a common source of knowledge, preserved with varying degrees of accuracy and completeness in the traditions of those populations, and recoverable by reading the traditions carefully, with eyes that are not committed to dismissing what does not fit the conventional framework. The full scope of the way station description in the Sumerian texts, when taken together with these cross-cultural parallels, creates a picture of the solar system's history that is radically different from the conventional one. The moon was not the product of a random impact event that conveniently produced an object of exactly the right size, mass, and orbital characteristics to stabilize Earth's axial tilt, regulate the tidal cycles that drove the development of early life, synchronize with human biological rhythms, and provide a platform from which the entire Earth's surface could be observed and managed. The probability of all these features arising by chance from a random impact event is, when computed honestly, extraordinarily low. The alternative that the Sumerian texts propose is simpler, more coherent, and more consistent with all the evidence. The moon is there because it was put there. It has the properties it has because it was designed to have them. The features that seem anomalous, the hollow interior, the bell-ringing resonance, the axial stabilization role, the biological synchrony, the convenient observation platform, are not anomalies. They are specifications. The specifications of an installation built for specific purposes by beings whose technology was sufficient to the task and whose reasons for installing it are recorded, in detail, in the oldest surviving written records of human civilization. The question that remains is not whether the Sumerians knew these things. They did know them, in the specific and accurate ways this investigation has documented. The question is what we do with that knowledge. The academic framework that has kept the Sumerian texts safely categorized as mythology has done its job for over a century, preventing the full implications of what the texts contain from reaching the broader conversation about human origins and history. That containment is becoming harder to maintain as each new piece of physical evidence, from the Apollo seismic data to the lunar luminescence measurements to the atmospheric tide research to the anomalies in the moon's moment of inertia, adds another data point that the Sumerian texts already described. The texts are waiting. They have been waiting for 4,000 years. They describe a history of this world that is older and stranger and more interesting than anything we have been taught. The moon is one piece of that history, the most visible piece, the one that looks back at us every night from its position of extraordinary precision, perfect in its size relative to the sun, perfect in its distance from Earth, perfect in its synchronization with the biological systems of the life it was designed to support and manage, silently ringing like a bell. The consideration that makes the Sumerian lunar descriptions most uncomfortable for the mainstream framework is not any individual piece of evidence. It is the accumulation. Each single description can be dismissed with a plausible alternative explanation. The pre-lunar texts are cosmological metaphor. The boat of heaven is a poetic sailing metaphor for the moon's appearance. The cold fire is a theological attribute of a deity. The calibrated phases are religious scheduling language for a natural cycle. The hollow interior is an incidental architectural metaphor in a religious text. The voice is a theological construct. The tidal knowledge is the result of long empirical observation. The way station is divine administrative mythology. Each dismissal is available. Each one requires only the assumption that the Sumerians were, in that specific case, doing what we assume they were always doing, making up poetic explanations for things they did not understand. But when you apply every dismissal simultaneously, when you require the Sumerians to be purely metaphorical about all 8 of these descriptions at once, despite the fact that in every other domain of their recorded knowledge their language is direct, practical, and empirically grounded, the cumulative implausibility of the dismissals becomes apparent. The Sumerians were not a metaphorical people in the way that dismissal requires. They were record keepers. They were administrators. They recorded grain prices in exact numbers. They recorded legal proceedings in precise procedural language. They recorded astronomical observations with the kind of systematic precision that allowed them to predict eclipses. They did not, as a cultural pattern, use poetic metaphor where direct description was available. The exception, the mainstream framework, requires that all 8 of these lunar descriptions are poetic metaphor, while everything else in the Sumerian archive is direct documentation, is not a small exception. It is a demand that the most precise and internally consistent body of cosmological knowledge in the Sumerian archive be categorized as the one area where the Sumerians abandoned their characteristic directness and precision in favor of elaborate mythological fancy. That demand is not justified by the texts themselves. It is justified only by the conclusion it is designed to protect. The conclusion that the Sumerians could not have known these things, therefore they could not have been describing them, therefore the descriptions must be metaphor. The research tradition that takes the Sumerian texts at face value, that reads them as the record of genuine historical knowledge transmitted from genuine historical teachers, with genuine historical knowledge of the solar system, produces a coherent picture, not a complete picture, not a proven picture, but a coherent one in which the 8 categories of lunar description fit together, support each other, and point toward a single underlying physical reality, a moon that was placed, that serves specific purposes, that has been accurately described by the civilization that received the most complete surviving record of what its builders and operators told them about it. The Sumerians were the beneficiaries of the most extraordinary educational program in human history. They received, in the short span of civilizational emergence between approximately 3,500 and 2000 BCE, a body of knowledge that included astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, law, architecture, and medicine, all at levels of sophistication that should have taken thousands more years to develop independently. They received it because they were given it, as the texts explicitly say they were given it, by the Anunnaki, in the context of an arrangement that the texts also describe in detail. It was the creation of a human labor force to serve specific operational purposes that the Anunnaki required of Earth. The moon is part of that context, not separate from it, not a myth attached to it. An essential component of the operational infrastructure that the Anunnaki established when they decided to use this planet for their purposes. Understanding the moon is essential to understanding the full scope of what the Sumerians were recording when they pressed their observations into clay and left them in the ruins of their cities for us to find 4,000 years later. We have looked at 8 specific categories of Sumerian description of the moon, 8 bodies of recorded observation and statement that do not fit the mainstream dismissal as primitive mythological imagination. We have looked at the time before the moon, described in cosmological language that matches the giant impact origin story that modern planetary science has arrived at independently. We have looked at the boat of heaven, a crescent-shaped vessel with a metallic surface, an interior crew performing specific technical functions, and movement driven by internal mechanisms rather than external forces. We have looked at the cold fire, the moon's intrinsic light output, distinguished from reflected sunlight by the Sumerians, in ways consistent with what the Apollo missions confirmed about lunar luminescence, and with the thermal properties of moonlight confirmed by modern measurement. We have looked at the calibrated phases, described not as a consequence of passive orbital geometry, but as the managed output of an active system subject to scheduled maintenance and correction during the dark moon interval. We have looked at the hollow interior, described as chambered and inhabited, consistent with the anomalous bell-ringing seismic behavior the Apollo instruments recorded. We have looked at the sound, the infrasonic voice transmitted through Earth's geology, and the operational hum of the boat's internal mechanisms. We have looked at the gravitational knowledge, the tidal mechanics, including the double tidal bulge and the orbital rotational timing discrepancy, described with a precision that no Bronze Age civilization should have possessed. And we have looked at the way station, the moon as the logistical hub, administrative center, and observation platform for an interplanetary operation conducted from Earth by beings the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. Each of these 8 descriptions, taken individually, can be argued away. The standard dismissals are available: metaphor, coincidence, primitive minds grasping at poetic explanations for natural phenomena. But the 8 descriptions do not exist individually. They form a pattern, a consistent, interconnected, mutually reinforcing pattern of specific physical detail that is accurate beyond what any dismissal can comfortably account for. The question the Sumerians force us to ask is a simple one, not easy to answer, but simple to ask. How did they know? The answer the texts themselves provide is that they were told by the Anunnaki. By beings who came from heaven to earth, who understood the solar system from the inside out, who knew the moon not as a feature of the night sky to be poetically described, but as a piece of their own infrastructure, to be precisely documented and accurately transmitted to the people they had placed upon the surface of this world. Whether that answer is correct cannot be determined from the texts alone. It requires looking further, at the archaeological evidence, at the astronomical anomalies, at the physics of the moon's formation and composition that continue to produce results that do not fit the standard model. It requires taking seriously the possibility that the ancient record is not a collection of primitive myth to be safely patronized and categorized and shelved. It requires taking seriously the possibility that the people who pressed their observations into wet clay 4,000 years ago knew what they were talking about. The investigation does not end here. It has barely begun. The Sumerian texts are one thread in a much larger tapestry. The Anunnaki are described across cultures, in texts that span thousands of miles and thousands of years, in descriptions that share too many specific details to be explained as independent mythological invention. The moon is one piece of a much larger picture that those texts, taken together, are trying to tell us. A picture of a solar system that was visited, of an Earth that was modified, of a species that was created, and of a history that begins long before the point where official scholarship has drawn the line of acceptable inquiry. If you are still here, you know that the line is in the wrong place. Subscribe and stay with us. The next investigation goes deeper.